Sometimes you have to wait a long time before you see the things that you have been waiting for. And I think that's the kind of thing that Anna and Simeon would say to us today if we asked them about their story. Luke in chapter 2 talks about these two prophets who are at the temple. And he says they're very old. They had lived a long time before these events took place. And they were longing for the coming of Messiah. They were waiting, they were watching for any sign that God is now at work. Any hint that something is about to happen, something is going to change. And they were waiting a long time. Simeon is ready to retire. Maybe some of you know how that feels. He was waiting for that time to come when God would console Israel, when God is going to come and bring his people back to himself, draw the whole world into his presence. He was longing for that time. And that had rooted deep in Simeon's heart. And he was promised that before he died, he would see the promised Messiah, the one chosen by God to make all these things happen. Anna too was also ready to retire. She had experienced in her life much suffering and sorrow. Luke tells us that she was only married for 7 years before her husband died, leaving her a widow. But she loved God and she was blessed by the Spirit, and she too was waiting, longing, hoping for a day to come that she would see with her eyes the things that she had perceived in her heart. Both prophets longing, waiting. And so I wonder what you have been waiting for and longing for. What promises has God made to you that you still long to see with your eyes? Because we might get weary of waiting. We might feel that time just continues to go on and on. I know that sometimes I do. 1 year slips into the next and you very quickly start feeling your age. And we start to ask ourselves the question, will life be any different to what we have always known? What are you waiting for? What sorrow have you carried with you through life that seems to have no answer? When Jesus' parents bring him to the temple, they are doing for him what other Jewish families would do for their firstborn sons. They have come to give thanks to God for this child, to offer their gifts as a symbol of their love and their gratitude to God. But as they come to the temple on that day, Simeon and Anna recognize that this is no ordinary moment. After all those long years of waiting, finally they are glimpsing the beginning of God's great salvation. Simeon takes Jesus in his hands, and he knows at once this child is the one. And he praises God, and he says, as you have promised, you may now dismiss your servant in peace. At last he has come. At last all those longings and dreams have now been met in this baby boy. And Anna too rejoiced. She who never left the temple day and night was overcome by the beauty of this child, the glory that radiated from him. Things are changing, and they knew it, they saw it. The world is going to be different because this child has been born. And they had eyes to see exactly what all of this meant. They'd been looking. They had been waiting for so long. And finally they see with their eyes what they had longed to see. But even in the midst of all that joy and rejoicing, there comes a realization that rejoicing is mixed up with something else. Suffering. Because when Simeon speaks a blessing over the child and his family, he has to say something in particular to Mary. And what he has to say would have definitely dampened the mood that day. He speaks about the path ahead of Jesus, that people would reject him, that his life would reveal the wickedness of the age. And finally, he says, a sword will pierce your soul as well. The arrival of the one they had been waiting for so long had come, and they were rejoicing. But there is a shadow side. It is not pure joy, pure happiness. Rather, Simeon has to warn them that there is going to be much that must be given up before rejoicing wins the day. And so as I think about that, my mind comes back to our own lives and the things that perhaps we have been waiting for. Because sometimes we might discover, as Mary and Joseph had to discover, that for the consolation and the salvation to come, we must face suffering. We might be asked to give up something that is precious to us. We might find out that others cannot journey with us any longer. Maybe friends and family who were once close to us have to choose to leave us. Jesus knew that experience himself. And as we follow his story through the gospel, we will find members of his family asking if he's insane. There'll be friends and disciples who will leave his side. There'll be the trusted ones, his closest friends. Some of them would choose to betray him. Jesus knew, as we all would come to know, that liberation and salvation might cost us something. But despite all of that, this story ends with good news. Luke tells us in the last verse of our reading that the child grew up and he became strong. He was filled with wisdom and the grace of God was upon him. Those words of Simeon and Anna must have stayed with Mary and Joseph as they left the temple that day. It would have been hard for them to carry, to know that their child was going to be at the centre of such world-changing events, and that this is going to bring sorrow as well as joy. But Jesus, we read, grew up and he became strong. He was filled with wisdom and understanding, and God had given him grace. So despite those notes of sorrow in this story, the story will end with joy. Jesus continues on his journey. He would indeed know suffering, and the temptation would always be there to turn back, to take the easy path, to find an easy way out. But he grew up. He continued to be filled with grace and wisdom. He held on to the will of God to the very end. And we know how that story ends. As Jesus held on to God, God held on to Jesus. Through the joys and through the sorrows of life, God held him. And as his friends and family eventually leave him, God held him. Even when they killed him, they put him into a borrowed tomb. God held him. And in the end, God raised him to life. And that is why Anna and Simeon can rejoice. They can rejoice because despite the sorrow and the suffering that must come, the end of the story is joy. Despite the things that we must learn to give up, the end of our story is joy, a joy that can never be extinguished. Because that resurrection of Jesus gives us hope that whatever struggles we must face in life, the end of our story is the same as Jesus' end. Because God holds us in the same way that he held Jesus, through our good times, through our bad times. If we are welcomed, if we are rejected, if we travel with friends, if we must go alone, God holds us. And if God is holding us, the end of the story will always be rejoicing. So what are you waiting for? Follow the example of Simeon and Anna. Lean into God's hands. Trust and believe that He has promised to do things for you, and He will do those things in your life. Remember that at times that might mean giving up something, of being willing to face things in life that you would rather run away from. But in the end, when the end of the story is written, there will be rejoicing, because life always conquers death. And may that give you hope as you wait for Messiah to come. Amen.